There is a kitchen in Coventry, 1962, and the light above it is a single bare bulb. Mrs. Edna Hartley stands at a formica worktop, her back to the door, doing something with dripping and stale bread that no cookbook published after 1970 will record. The smell is deep and savory, animal and warm. Her hands move without hesitation. She has done this 10,000 times. She learned it from watching, not reading, and she never thought to ask where the knowledge came from because it had always simply been there. It would not always be there. To understand how this was lost, you have to go back to the moment it was born, not in a kitchen, but in a ration queue. Britain, 1940. The weekly allowance for a family is 1 shilling and 10 pence of meat, 2 ounces of butter and 1 egg. Not poverty as failure, poverty as curriculum. The women standing in those queues, women like Mrs. Dorothy Birch of Sheffield, who kept a household of 5 on a weekly budget measured in shillings rather than pounds, were not making do. They were building something. A Ministry of Food leaflet from 1943, dog-eared and flour-dusted, told them how to stretch what they had. But the knowledge that formed in those kitchens went far beyond any printed leaflet. Here is the first and most important twist of this entire story. The women who had the least built the food system that wasted nothing and nourished everything. The industry that replaced them sells the illusion of abundance whilst delivering less. Number 23, dripping on toast. Rendered beef fat, collected after roasting and stored in a cold larder held between 38 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit by the stone of the north-facing wall, not by machinery, by architecture. Spread onto bread in a layer thick enough to carry flavor, protein and fat in a single mouthful. It was a complete meal. It cost almost nothing. Older women recalled eating it for breakfast before school, before work, before a day's labor, and feeling genuinely sustained. Number 22, bread and scrape economics. The last of the butter ration applied with a knife held flat and drawn across the widest possible surface of the bread, producing a film so thin it was almost translucent. This was not deprivation theatre, this was geometry applied to scarcity, the conscious management of surface area against resource. The bread tasted of butter because the flavor was distributed perfectly. Number 21, pot liquor. The water in which vegetables had been boiled, cloudy with minerals and starch and flavor, never poured down the drain, collected in a lidded jar and used within 48 hours as the base of a soup or the liquid in a gravy. It cost nothing, it was already made. Until the washing up became more important than the liquid, and the jar stopped appearing beside the cooker. The larder itself was the second character in this story, not a cupboard, but a system. Mrs. Agnes Pearce, a Women's Institute organizer in Yorkshire in 1947, understood the larder as a living archive. A WI bulletin from that year, circulated among branches, described the management of seasonal produce as a year-round discipline, not a summer hobby. In homes where refrigeration did not yet exist, and in the late 1940s, the majority of British households had none, the larder operated on principles of airflow, temperature, and timing that were as precise as any laboratory protocol. Number 20, salt crust storage for root vegetables. Carrots, parsnips, and beetroot layered into wooden boxes packed with dry sand or fine salt, stored in the coolest corner of the larder through autumn and into winter. A box prepared in October could yield firm, usable carrots in February. The cold did the work. The salt managed the moisture. The knowledge was in knowing which vegetables to pack and which to hang, which to clamp outside and which to bring in, and in what order to use them as the season deepened. Number 19, rendered lard seal on potted meats. Cooked pork or beef pressed into a jar whilst still warm, with a thin cap of liquid lard poured over the surface and left to set. The fat hardened into an airtight seal that preserved the meat for weeks without refrigeration. The method was documented in pre-war housekeeping manuals and spoken of matter-of-factly in health visitor reports from the early 1950s as standard practice. Number 18, hanging herb bundles in larder airflow. Dried thyme, bay and sage suspended from hooks in specific positions relative to the larder's ventilation, not randomly, but in calculated relation to the current of cool air moving through the space, to deter pantry moths and to flavor the ambient atmosphere of the room. The herbs did 2 jobs at once. Everything in this system did 2 jobs at once. That was the point. That was what no one thought to record. By 1949, women like Miss Jean Sutherland, a domestic science teacher in Birmingham, were transmitting this knowledge through schools. A domestic science textbook from that period described the principles of food economy with an authority that now reads as remarkable. Not recipes, but systems. Not instructions, but logic. The logic spread. Number 17. Oatmeal water. Oats soaked overnight in cold water, the liquid strained off in the morning and used in two distinct ways. As a thickener for gravies and sauces, and as a settling drink for children with upset stomachs. The same preparation, 2 applications, 1 10-minute action the night before. Number 16. Bone broth simmered 6 to 8 hours. This was not a wellness trend, this was Monday. After Sunday's roast, the bones went into the pot with cold water, a splash of malt vinegar to draw the minerals from the bone, an onion halved and unpeeled, and whatever vegetable scraps had accumulated through the week. By Monday evening, the liquid had reduced to a jelly that set solid and amber in the larder overnight, the protein and gelatin extracted completely, the cost nothing that had not already been spent. Number 15. Stale bread as breadcrumb economy. No loaf was wasted. Stale bread was dried in the oven at the lowest possible heat, the cooker already warm from baking, until it was completely dry, then crumbled and stored in a tin on the larder shelf. The breadcrumbs served as coating for fried fish, as a topping for gratin dishes, as a thickener pressed into soups. The sequence was timed to the week's baking rhythm. New bread baked, old bread into the oven to dry, crumbs into the tin back on the shelf. Nothing moved outside the system. By 1951, Mrs. Vera Dobson, an allotment holder in Nottingham whose plot was no larger than a single parking space, was managing a seasonal food calendar that an allotment society newsletter from that year would have recognized and praised. In summer, the allotment produced faster than any household could eat. The answer was preservation. Number 14, pickling in the green glut season. Brine pickling in 1-gallon stoneware crocks, packed with surplus runner beans, green tomatoes, cucumber and cauliflower. The salt ratio calibrated by region and by household custom, with older women recalling a figure close to 1 ounce of salt per pint of water as the reliable standard. The crocks went to the back of the larder. The summer extended into winter. Number 13, cooking apple water as a setting agent. Apple peelings and cores, the parts discarded, boiled down in a small pan to a pale, slightly viscous liquid rich in natural pectin. Poured into jam making at the point of setting, it replaced commercial pectin entirely. Jam set firmer. The apples were already paid for. The cores cost nothing. This was the hidden engine of the jamming tradition, and it operated in silence beneath every jar on every shelf until the generation that knew about pectin stopped existing in the kitchen. Number 12, potato water for bread making. The starchy water from a pan of boiled potatoes, cooled to blood temperature and used in place of plain water in bread dough. The starch fed the yeast, improving the rise. The loaf stayed fresh for 2 to 3 days longer than a loaf made with plain water. The potato water cost nothing. It was already there. And then something arrived. In 1957, an advertisement in the Daily Mirror, half a page, bright and cheerful, told British women that convenience was not a compromise, it was progress. The brands had executives whose job was to make the knowledge in the larder feel old. They were very good at their jobs. Here is the second twist. The domestic food system that had built itself across 15 years of rationing and post-war reconstruction was so efficient, so completely woven into the daily rhythm of the household, that no one had thought to write it down in full. It looked like instinct. It was mastery. And mastery that is invisible cannot be defended when something brighter arrives on the shelf. Number 11. The cold fat pastry method. Hands washed in cold water and dried. Fat taken directly from the larder. Cold, firm, almost hard. Rubbed into flour quickly, with the fingertips only, before the warmth of the hands could melt the fat into the flour and collapse the structure. The pastry produced was short, flaky, and crisp in a way that no commercial pastry mix has ever replicated, because the knowledge was not in the recipe. It was in the temperature of the hands and the speed of the motion and the sound the flour made when the fat was cut in correctly, a soft, sandy rustle that told you when to stop. That knowledge lived in the hands. When the hands stopped practicing, it was gone. Number 10. Onion skin stock coloring. The dry outer skins of brown onions, the papery layers usually dropped into the bin, added to the stock pot and simmered for the full duration of the broth. The tannins in the skins produced a deep, warm amber color in the finished stock, identical in appearance to commercial stock that achieved the same color with caramel coloring and additives. Free, perpetual, seasonal, available every time an onion was peeled. The post-war peak of this knowledge runs from approximately 1952 to 1958. During those years, a health visitor's report from Bristol recorded the household of Mrs. Lillian Marsh as exemplary in its management of food economy, a phrase that, in the clinical language of the report, meant that Mrs. Marsh wasted nothing, fed her family of 4 on a constrained budget, and maintained a standard of nutrition that the report described as consistent and adequate. Consistent and adequate. It was, in truth, a remarkable domestic achievement. Number 9, vinegar as a dual-purpose agent. A single bottle of malt vinegar serving 2 functions without being divided or separated. Used at full strength for pickling, the sharp, clean smell of it filling the kitchen on preserving days, then diluted with water for wiping down surfaces, cleaning the inside of the larder, removing grease from shelves. 1 material, 2 applications, 1 purchase, extended across weeks of use. The economy was total. Number 8, mustard as a meat extender. A level teaspoon of dry mustard powder stirred into the flour used to dredge meat before browning, or added directly to the braising liquid of a stew. The mustard did not make the dish taste of mustard. It amplified the savory depth of whatever small quantity of meat was present. 4 ounces of braising beef in a pot with root vegetables could feed a family of 4 because the mustard made the meat taste like more than it was. The science is straightforward. Volatile compounds in mustard activate the same receptors as the Maillard flavors produced by browning. The women using this method did not know the chemistry. They knew the result. Number 7, suet pudding as a caloric delivery system. A basin lined with suet pastry, filled with whatever was available, a small quantity of meat or treacle or dried fruit covered, tied with cloth, and steamed over a pot of boiling water for 2 hours. The ratio of flour to sweet was not measured in many households. It was calibrated by eye and by feel, learned by watching a mother or grandmother make it dozens of times before attempting it alone. The pudding was filling in the way that almost nothing produced since has been filling, because the caloric density was exactly matched to the energy demands of the people eating it. Then came 1958. The third and final twist arrives here, and it is the cruelest of the 3. The refrigerator did not replace the larder's knowledge. It made the larder's knowledge feel embarrassing. Women who had managed cold storage through architecture and timing were presented with a machine that managed it automatically, and the machine was presented as liberation. Some households acquired a refrigerator on hire purchase by the early 1960s. The larder began to empty of its logic. Cold storage without understanding produced something the previous generation had never known: food waste. The jar of pot liquor forgotten at the back of the fridge, the bones thrown away instead of boiled, the apple cores dropped into the bin. Number 6, weekly bread baking as yeast management. A small portion of the previous week's dough, a fist-sized piece kept wrapped in the cool of the larder, used as the starter for the following week's loaf. The yeast in the dough remained alive. The flavor deepened slightly week by week. The system was self-perpetuating, zero waste, and produced bread with a complexity of flavor that commercial sliced bread, introduced at scale in British supermarkets in the late 1950s, could not approach. When the sliced loaf became cheaper than the time it took to bake, the starter was thrown away and never replaced. Number 5, boiling a fruitcake in a cloth. A dense, fruit-heavy cake mixture wrapped tightly in a floured cloth and lowered into a large pot of simmering water for 3 to 4 hours. No oven required, produced in households with only a kitchen range or a single gas ring in the years before electric cookers standardized across British homes. The result was a cake with a close, moist crumb and a deep, slightly caramelized flavor produced by the long, slow, even heat of the water. The technique was effectively extinct in domestic British kitchens by approximately 1960, not because it failed, it did not fail, but because it looked laborious next to a tin of ready-made cake. By the mid-1960s, Miss Patricia Howarth was teaching domestic science in Manchester to a class of girls who had already grown up watching their mothers choose convenience over method. A domestic science syllabus from the period following the 1963 Newsom report was beginning to reframe household education as consumer literacy rather than practical mastery. The shift was quiet, no announcement, just a change in what the lesson covered and a change in what the lesson did not. Number 4, rendering fat at home from butcher scraps. Collecting suet and fat trimmings from the butcher, often given free or sold for pence, and melting them slowly in a heavy pan until the fat ran clear and the solid pieces crisped into scratchings. The rendered fat, poured off and stored in a basin in the larder, became lard for pastry, dripping for toast, grease for the baking tin. Free, reusable, produced at home in an hour. When pre-packaged lard appeared on the supermarket shelf and the act of rendering began to smell to a new generation of something old and slightly unpleasant, the practice stopped. Number 3, egg preservation in water glass. Sodium silicate solution, water glass, sold in hardware shops for pennies, mixed with water and poured into a large stoneware crock. Fresh eggs from the summer glut, unwashed and uncracked, lowered carefully into the solution and submerged. The silicate sealed the pores of the shell and prevented spoilage. Eggs preserved in this way remained usable for months, carrying households through the winter when laying slowed. The method was documented in pre-war housekeeping manuals and remained in use in rural households into the early 1950s. In most urban British homes, it was gone by 1958. Number 2, the crown-to-cavity sequence. A single joint of meat or a whole bird, purchased on a Saturday, managed across an entire week through a fixed sequence of preparations. Roasted on Sunday, served cold in slices on Monday, chopped into a hash with onion and potato on Tuesday, the carcass boiled for stock on Wednesday, the set stock used as the base of a soup on Thursday, the remaining dripping rendered for the following week's cooking on Friday. 5 to 7 meals from a single purchase. The knowledge required to execute this sequence, the timing, the cold storage conditions, the recognition of when each stage of the meat was safe to use and how, was not written in any single place. It was distributed across the hands and habits of the women who performed it weekly, without thinking of it as remarkable because it was simply what you did. Until it wasn't. In 1980, the domestic science curriculum across most English local education authorities formally removed larder management, home preservation, and made from scratch thickening and setting techniques from the standard school syllabus. A generation of girls born between 1965 and 1975 grew up without learning a single one of these practices from either school or home. Which brings us to number 1, the Sunday stock pot. The pot that every other practice in this film flows from and returns to. The large pan, cast iron, heavy, dark with use, placed on the cooker every Sunday morning to receive whatever the week had produced. Bones from the roast, vegetable water saved in a jar by the sink, apple cores from the Friday baking, herb stems stripped of their leaves, the papery skins of onions. Simmered for hours. Strained through a cloth into a bowl. Left in the larder to set overnight into a jelly that smelled of the whole week's cooking, savory and deep and absolutely specific to that household, that season, that larder. The 23 practices described in this film were not separate tips. They were not tricks, they were one integrated knowledge with the stock pot at its center. When the pot stopped, the system lost its organizing logic. The practices that depended on it, the bone broth, the pot liquor, the onion skin coloring, the bread made with potato water, the fruitcake wrapped in cloth, did not disappear all at once. They faded practice by practice, household by household across the years between 1958 and 1980, replaced not by anything better but by something easier and shinier and entirely dependent on someone else's factory. There is a kitchen somewhere in England today. It is spotless. It is full of appliances, every one of them humming. On the shelf above the cooker sits an unopened jar of stock cubes. The cooker is cold. There is no pot on it. There is no smell of bones or bay or onion skin. There is no jar of vegetable water by the sink, no crock of eggs in sodium silicate solution, no bundle of dried herbs hanging in the airflow, no tin of breadcrumbs on the shelf, no piece of dough kept in cloth for next week's loaf. The knowledge that built a family's survival across rationing, winter, illness, and genuine scarcity is not in this room. Between two women's lifetimes it was here, and then it was gone.